All right, hey, what's up, guys? We are live. Welcome in, everybody. Hop in the chat if you have not already. We're gonna do the normal Sunday thing, right? We basically now are talking about playoff chances of Cincinnati on a week by week basis until they lose, which they didn't on Saturday. But boy, if they didn't make it as close as absolutely possible, and at pretty inopportune timing for Cincinnati on that front as well. But it does also raise the point that I think there is a double standard toward Cincinnati and Oklahoma. So I'm really calling it a Big 12 double standard today that we're going to talk about in terms of how these teams are judged based on their losses and the quality of said losses or the quality of said wins. I shouldn't say losses. This is more about the wins here with Oklahoma and Cincinnati. Obviously, they have not lost. It's the quality close wins or how harshly you're judged on your close wins, I think is what really has been laid bare this weekend in college football. And I was even listening to Paul Feinbaum just before this because look, Sundays, I'm always trying to just get my hands on whatever college football podcast content I can get. And Sundays, ESPN does like a college football podcast with Matthew Berry and Paul Feinbaum, and just hearing them go after Cincinnati and go after anybody that's defending Cincinnati, and then at the same time say, well, Alabama should be worried because they've had like these 4 bad games this year, but make no mention of the fact that perhaps Alabama just isn't that great of a team. It's of course they're just playing down to their level of competition, and that's why fans should be worried. It just there's such a double standard going on right now with how Cincinnati and Oklahoma are treated versus the rest of everybody else in light of what happened specifically this weekend. And it's not even just bad performances by some of the teams at the top, like Ohio State, certainly fits that bill, like Oregon, certainly fits that bill, Alabama. But it's also that a couple of these teams now have common opponents, and those results actually stack up pretty similarly. And yet the narrative is Oklahoma has been playing poorly and beating teams. Cincinnati has been playing poorly and beating teams. But Ohio State, Alabama, they're going to be okay because they're Ohio State and Alabama. They're just taking some scares in here. So very frustrating. I want to talk about that and some of the specifics of that. Elsewhere on the docket tonight, we're definitely going to talk just in general about how ugly those wins were and what it potentially means for Bama, Ohio State, and Oregon, because I think even beyond just all the arguing and hemming and hawing about playoff rankings right now and where they're at in the college football playoff, there's also an element here of like how likely is it that they now lose a game and how have the dynamics on that changed? Like how likely is it that we see some chaos and teams losing up above Cincy, perhaps breathing some new life into them? It's a little bit muddied, especially when you think about like who the teams are that could be the giant killers here and what that would do. Like Michigan State could come back into play after losing this weekend, for instance. You know that I'm not going to get through an entire live chat without taking shots at Texas for another debilitating loss. I mean, not losing to Iowa State, losing on the road at Iowa State. There's no shame in that at all, obviously, this year. But losing in the fashion that Texas did, giving up, what was it, 23 unanswered in the second half, and just laying a complete and total egg in the second half. Picking up some dubious history for Steve Sarkisian along the way. You guys saw in the tease for this video, the title for this video, I said the dumbest Big 12 storyline of the year. The dumbest Big 12 storyline of the year involves the Texas Longhorns. And it's not just the storyline of their futility. It's those that have been caping up and defending Texas and what the excuse making has been about for Sark and company so far this year. So we are going to talk about that. Texas fans, if there are any that hang out in the chat today, I will just say I am very encouraged by that Black Friday game coming up between K-State and Texas now at this point. That does not look like a monumental task at all anymore for my Cats. And shout out to K-State for dominating Kansas for a 13th straight time this weekend as well. Michigan State gets knocked out. That was very predictable to me. We can talk about the Spartans and what that means for the Big 12's playoff chances, obviously resting mostly with Cincinnati, but also with Oklahoma State. And that is another storyline this week that we just have not talked much about. Like Oklahoma State is just quietly creeping around now, and they're finally getting onto the radar of even some of the national pundits. Again, I will mention I was listening to the ESPN college football podcast, and Matt Berry and Paul Feinbaum actually had some fairly nice things to say about the Cowboys and how they are sneaking around. The Yahoo Sports college football podcast mentioned that today as well. How Oklahoma is just kind of laying in the weeds waiting, ready to pounce if somebody gives them an opportunity. So that is worth mentioning. They're kind of in the driver's seat right now for that second spot in the Big 12 title game, but it's not quite that simple because Iowa State is still lurking around there with only 2 league losses. Oklahoma State has 1. If they lose that game to Oklahoma, tiebreakers become involved here. Baylor obviously is still involved. You basically still have the same teams. Just things have been shaken up a bit with Baylor losing this weekend, obviously, to TCU, which kudos to the Frogs for that win. Their first win without Gary Patterson since 2000, the year 2000, which was wild to hear. But Jerry Kill gets it done as an interim coach. So there's a lot to talk about with what's going on in the Big 12 right now and beyond. Big 12 present and future, Cincinnati playoff chances, et cetera, et cetera. So let's get the ball rolling. In the chat, I will remind you, as I do every single week, you can donate by clicking the $ below the Say Something in the chat box below where you obviously type in your chat there. I'll try and keep up with the chat as much as I can here throughout the live show. Depending on what's going on, I may pick up on some of your comments, but if you want to make sure that your question or comment gets up to the top and I do see it, you can donate as well as it goes along. So big picture, college football weekend. I think the frustrating part to me about this weekend is, one, that Nebraska, Washington, LSU couldn't come through and actually get the victories that would take some of this discussion and debate out of things. I feel like it's been a pretty long and stressful week for those of us that are trying to advocate on behalf of Cincinnati, advocate on behalf of just teams that come from outside of the Big Ten or the SEC, or really just teams that come from outside of Columbus, Ohio, or Tuscaloosa, Alabama, because you guys have heard my complaints all week long about how they just get more benefit of the doubt than anybody else in the country, and that also includes even teams from their own conferences. They just continually get that. So I was really hoping that one of those teams would be able to pull off the upset and we wouldn't be sitting here talking instead about like minute details and trying to just break down the minutia of everything that's going on and parsing through resumes. But that's what we're going to have to do. With Bama, Ohio State, and Oregon all winning ugly on Saturday, we're talking about a 3-7 team and 2 4-5 teams that they beat. The 3-7 team being Nebraska, and then LSU and Washington being 4-5 teams. And like Washington being a team that may be on the verge of firing its coach, and Jimmy Lake, who's had just a very rough week, if you paid any attention to that. So that's not great for Oregon, but they did come through with a victory. And Alabama, an LSU team that we know is firing its coach already. That is not an impressive win at all. It would have to feel almost like a loss, I would think, if you're an Alabama fan. And that is not the first time we've seen that this year. And that's a part of the problem here, man. I mean, there was so much that happened that to me was fairly vindicating for those of us that were frustrated by the same things in the initial college football playoff rankings. A big part of it, and don't let this get lost in what's going on here, is the committee very clearly ranked Mississippi State 17th and Minnesota 20th to help bolster the resumes of Alabama and Ohio State. And that is not just me saying that. Again, I will reference the Yahoo Sports College Football Podcast. I really enjoy those guys. Dan Wetzel brought that up on the Yahoo Sports College Football Podcast, that there was really no other reason that you could justify ranking Minnesota 20th and Mississippi State 17th other than just to bolster the resumes of the teams that you are really trying to boost and who this all really revolves around, Alabama and Ohio State. Well, what happened? They promptly lost dumb games. Mississippi State loses to Arkansas, and in even dumber fashion, Minnesota loses at home to Illinois, and I believe scored 6 points, right? The final of that was like 14-6. So, yeah, brutal, man. Brutal. And clearly they were not deserving of that spot, and clearly it's a part of this whole propaganda machine to prop up the two teams, Ohio State and Alabama, that we always see get propped up. Happy to see that, certainly. I do kind of have a soft spot for Mike Leach, so I'm not necessarily rooting against him, but he's kind of collateral damage in where my rooting interests are right now. And to be honest, like, I'm going to go into this discussion, I'm going to try to do it with more an air of honesty than what I heard from Feinbaum when I was listening to Feinbaum earlier today. And Feinbaum was just killing people at the network. He was specifically saying people at this network, so at ESPN, that were defending Cincinnati and saying all these people have an agenda. All these people have an agenda. Well, Paul Feinbaum has an agenda more than anybody because he's worked in SEC country and represented the SEC for so long, written books about it, yada, yada. Like he has an SEC focused, SEC centric agenda because that's good for him. It's good for his business and all of that. And I'm not even saying there's anything wrong with that. That's there for us to rage against. That's there for us to get frustrated by. That exists for that purpose. And everyone's going to have their own biases. But what kills me is when you can't just admit that you have some of that you have a bias and an agenda when you're going to say that other people do too. Because later on in the podcast, it's, well, Alabama's had 4 or 5 games where they just haven't been up for it. I mean, Paul spent this whole diatribe about why Alabama wouldn't be motivated for the game against LSU and blah, 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 and making excuses, which clearly reveals that's an agenda. There's an agenda that's out there for that. So I will be honest here and just say, like, my agenda is, yes, I definitely want to advocate on behalf of the Big 12. It is a Big 12-centric agenda here. The Big 12 is not paying me, but I'm a Big 12 fan. I live in Big 12 country. I covered the league for 10 years. I have a very vested interest in the league. So I do have biases there, and I'm just going to be honest about that and open about it here. Now, having said all of that, I don't think it's fair that Oklahoma has been crucified for bad wins and just eking by when we've seen now all of these teams, Bama, Ohio State, and Oregon, do it time and time again throughout the course of this season. Like Alabama, let's take Alabama, for instance. Remember that game against Florida. And this is a part of timing has helped Alabama on this deal with Florida because at the time, it seemed like, oh, wow, Florida's a pretty good team. Mullen's been pretty good. And that's a close game in the swamp. Okay, that's fine. Took some real stones to pull that one out. Well, now, I mean, Florida's 4-5. They just lost by almost 30 to freaking South Carolina. Like, Dan Mullen's a disaster, a total mess on the verge of getting fired. Alabama almost lost to that team. LSU is 4-5. They've already fired Coach O. Ed Orgeron is gone. Alabama rushed for 6 yards at home on Saturday. 6 yards at home on Saturday against LSU. That's not good. And oh, by the way, they lost to a backup quarterback at Texas A&M. I did see Calzada for Heisman in the chat in there from somebody. Who was that? SEC football. Calzada for Heisman. So I assume SEC for Heisman that you are a Texas A&M fan then. And I see SEC football. Don't compare Bama having a close win against LSU or Florida. Big 12 teams that almost beat OU don't compare to LSU or Florida. GTFO. Look, SEC football. I appreciate you being in the chat, but I'm gonna say this as clearly as I can into the mic. GTFO with that. That is exactly the problem with the SEC here and the hype machine that just props itself up. Florida is a disaster of a football team right now. LSU is a disaster of a football team right now. There is more to winning football games than looking good in the uniform and putting stars next to your name on Rivals.com. Winning games actually matters, and how you compete on the field actually matters. What do you think, SEC football, of South Carolina? They were up 40-10 on Florida. You cannot tell me that Florida is a better team than than West Virginia, right? Okay, so like West Virginia was a close game that Oklahoma played. Kansas State. Florida is not a better team than K-State right now. Florida is not a better team than West Virginia right now with the way that they're playing. Like I can't. Yes, and AMAC points out, I mean, Florida just fired two coaches within the last hour. They are a mess, and that is the just arrogant as hell SEC attitude that comes through here. Well, look at the gator on the side of the helmet, and look at the LSU, look at the jersey and the tiger, and that doesn't mean bleep. Like, show me what they're doing on the field. They suck. They're not good teams. Those are not good teams. So yes, I will get in there and say that Alabama playing close games against those teams has to count against their resume. It is not good, and it is the same damn thing as what Oklahoma has been doing this year. SEC football, you have no argument other than they have better raw talent. Raw talent you don't win a game for having better raw talent. It's what you can actually do when you get out on the field. SEC football, how would you answer this? Like Texas, what do you make? How do you seem to be a Texas A&M fan. So how do you reconcile what Texas is then? Are you going to tell me that Texas actually is a better team than virtually everybody else in the Big 12 that's been a better program than them over the last 10 years just because they have recruiting stars next to their name? Is Texas this year a better team than Oklahoma State because they have better recruiting stars? No, they're not. They're a mess. They're a freaking mess. And the stars do not matter in this context because of what they're actually doing out there on the field. So that is a horrible argument, and I'm not going to stand here for you making that here throughout the chat. And the least you could do is donate a little something if you're going to make an argument just that god awful and that draped in the just SEC chant that comes out in that every single word, just brain dead. It's a brain dead SEC chant without looking at anything or analyzing anything else that's going on in the game of college football. And you guys think you can just slap a little jersey or a little patch on the jersey that says SEC and it just nothing else matters. Like that's it. And poof, everything else is gone. No, man, that's not how it works. That's not how it works. And by the way, the issue here is not really with Texas A&M, who continues to play really well and landed a couple tremendous recruits over the weekend. So congratulations to you on that. I don't have anything to talk against Texas A&M for, but that doesn't mean that it's a blanket statement that covers the entire league. It does not mean Florida is a good team. It does not mean LSU is a good team, because you have to actually go win some games and do some bleep on the field. And so Alabama messing around with those teams absolutely needs to count against their resume. And it's when you back that up with the loss to a backup quarterback against Texas A&M that they don't have a very good resume. And let's take, before I get to the bigger picture implications here, let's undress Ohio State. Ohio State just played a very close game with Nebraska. If Nebraska had any semblance of a competent special teams outfit, this game may be going a different way, but we've seen it time and time again this year. Scott Frost has the worst special teams in America, and he cannot get it figured out, and Nebraska loses a close game. Ohio State played a close game at home against Penn State. That's an unranked team, according to the College Football Playoff Selection Committee, somehow leaving them out instead of Minnesota. You've got the Tulsa game, which is very apropos based on what else we're talking about this weekend. Remember that Ohio State was in a battle at home in the fourth quarter with Tulsa. That was a one-score game in the fourth quarter with Tulsa having a chance to tie it at the shoe. So it was the same situation that Cincinnati was in here, and we've seen that now for Ohio State. And also, they have the game where they got punked, obviously, by Oregon and actually have a loss. And then Oregon. And I'll use Robert's donation in question here, and I appreciate it, Robert. He says, how is Oregon in the college football playoff top four? The Pac-12 blows. They beat Ohio State. The Big Ten is overrated too. Yeah, I agree with you on all fronts there, Robert, and thank you very much for the donation. Let's go look at good old Oregon. They lost to 3-6 Stanford. And, this is the thing. I understand the Ohio State win, but look at the rest of the resume. It's not very impressive. They farted around with Washington. They farted around with Cal, who's 3-6, and just gave Arizona its first win in 2 years. And then Oregon also lost to 3-6 Stanford, who, if you weren't paying attention on Friday, got just blitzed to the tune. It was 52-7 or 52-6 to Utah. Stanford is also, speaking of dumpster fires, a dumpster fire. And Oregon actually lost to that team. We're not even talking about a close win at that point. That is a loss. So all of these teams' resumes, if we're going to hold that up against Oklahoma, which had to sit toward the back end of the top 10 there because of the committee's BS and this, their wins are not good enough. They've been messing around with bad. Well, look at everybody else. Everybody else is in the same boat. And what is immensely frustrating to me about all of this is that the narrative now is, and I saw it from Heather Dinich, who tweeted out, in fact, I can just pull up the basic tweet for you here. Heather Dinich tweeted out hey, basically, to paraphrase, everything is going to stay the same. Yeah, here it is. Aside from Michigan State, as it stands this skinny minute, I'm thinking because just about everyone else won ugly, it might not change things as much as you think. I mean, that is, I just hate that Oklahoma has to sit there and just eat it before the first rankings and for most of this season about how they mess around with Nebraska, Tulane, who else on the schedule? West Virginia. They have not been Kansas. They have not been winning impressively. They get drilled for that while still, by the way, not having lost a game. And then this week we see everybody that was ahead of them in the rankings go out there and either lay an egg or come very close to laying an egg. And probably you could still consider it laying an egg. Bama, Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan State, all these teams go out there and on Saturday. But yet the storyline is, well, everything has to stay the same because of that. Oklahoma didn't play. All these other teams played poorly. Everything has to stay the same. No, it does not. No, it does not. I would think this would be the perfect time to step back and reevaluate and say, well, hey, wait, hang on a second. Oklahoma actually now looks a little bit better by comparison, and we judged Oklahoma too harshly in week 1 because of their quote-unquote bad wins. And now we're seeing that a lot of other teams have these bad wins as well, combined with some of them having losses. Actually, upon further consideration, we need to change this. And that should be exactly the type of thing that the committee is here for. And I know that this is like a total wishful thinking, like something that would never happen. Like, just my hopes are too high with this. This is too in an ideal world type of thinking. But that should be why the committee is there, to be able to have that sort of thought process instead of a computer that wouldn't be able to compute that sort of thing. The committee could say, well, we can change our opinion based on new information, which has always been the idea, right? That's why, TCU can be third and then beat Iowa State by 50 and then drop to 6th all of a sudden because, hey, we had new information available, new data points on Ohio State, whatever it is, whatever BS they want to throw out there. They've done it before and they have that power. So the power is absolutely there to say, actually, Oklahoma, your resume looks better by comparison. We're gaining some perspective here on what was happening with the other teams across the country. We're going to move you up a little bit because it's our bad. We see you. We judge you too harshly. We know that won't happen, but I think that's something that should, and it's something that absolutely should be considered. And we don't need to be resigned to, well, let's just stop and say everybody was bad, so everybody kind of gets a pass. This is just a blank slate. No, consider it within the context of the rest of the season and consider it within the context of the rest of what Oklahoma's resume actually is. We're going to find out. I mean, no matter what, we're going to find out some things about Oklahoma, and they will have a chance to move up in the rankings because the rest of the schedule, it's Baylor this week, and then it's Iowa State, and then it's Oklahoma State. 2 of those 3 games are on the road. So that is not going to be easy to finish the year for Oklahoma, and we will find out likely everything we need to know about what it is they actually are as a team. But if they run the table through that and then go play, whether it's Bedlam round 2 or Iowa State again in the Big 12 championship game and win that game, like they will be in. They certainly will be in. But regardless, they had this precedent set that like there's no way they could get in with 1 loss because of where they started in the rankings. And I will continue to think that's pretty unjust, especially compared to some of the other teams around them. Oh, by the way, Wake Forest, that was another team. Gary Barta from the committee said, we actually had a hard time deciding Wake Forest or Oklahoma. Wake Forest. They go out and lose a non-conference game to North Carolina, who's been a total disaster this year. So, again, that's another team to tack on there that laid an egg on Saturday that had been in that same discussion. And we see the bad wins thing applied more heavily toward Oklahoma and Cincinnati than anybody else. And of course, I don't think it's much of a coincidence that is a team that's currently in the Big 12 and a team that's going to be in the Big 12. And that's kind of where the biases lay. There's just not a lot of love for this league. And I'm not even out here saying that all of that is like conspiratorial. It's just that's where the respect level is nationally for the league. And another thing that I heard Feinbaum say today that really made me mad was, it was Matthew Berry that kind of first brought up the point, and then Feinbaum slammed it home. But it was like, why do people get so upset about the first week of the playoff rankings? Everything will work itself out. It's because it frames narratives. It sets up where teams are going to be throughout the rest of this process. And, when we see systemically things like the AAC not getting anybody ranked, but Minnesota and Mississippi State jumping into Iowa, jumping into the initial top 25. So there's no top 25 wins available for Tulsa or Cincinnati the rest of the year. Like that, those kind of things do matter, and they set narratives. And this is a league that is in a position where nobody really respects it, and you have to fight and scrap for every inch. So yes, we'll get upset about it. And I think justifiably so, and try and yell and scream and do whatever it is that you can to make something happen about it, because that's what we have. And what the SEC has is just a catbird seat where they can be perched up above there, and Alabama can get every single benefit of the doubt. Any other team can get, we got whoever that dude was, SEC, whatever, running around here saying that LSU and Florida, giving LSU and Florida the benefit of the doubt at a combined 8 and 10 this year. as far as their record goes. 2 games below 500 collectively with 1 fired coach and 1 potentially fired coach, and they'll get the benefit of the doubt. That's not the position that this league is in. It needs people to fight for it. And so, yes, these rankings do actually matter considerably. And I would think that would not be a concept as hard, as difficult to grasp for somebody in that position as it seemed to be there. But that's just kind of the aloof national attitude where you don't have a stake. You don't need to pay attention to the Big 12. So whatever. Boom to the Sooner. Appreciate the donation. Grab a drink real quick. Appreciate the donation. Boom to the Sooner. Is the committee using different logic to keep 2015 out for 1 less game while not propping OU up for 1 more game last week? Would that be just, has Oklahoma played 1 more game than others? I mean, some of that's going to even out now with them having the bye week this past week. I think really ultimately the thing with that storyline, though, the extra data point storyline from back then, is it just fits into this larger narrative of like, the goalposts will move. Like the committee will move goalposts whenever possible, whenever they want it to get whoever it is they need to get in. So I just don't even know that we can really take too seriously what the reasoning is from the committee at one given time versus another, because it's just always going to change based on what they think that year. And there's not even that's kind of one of those like don't hate the player, hate the game scenarios where it's like, a committee that's being tasked with doing this and asked to do this, there's always going to be a certain level of that, because that's just the you can't have like these arbitrary rankings without having some biases and trying to maneuver around some other pieces to logically get to where it is that you want to go. So really the issue should just be with like the system in general, which is why we're all pushing for a 12-team playoff, because if you get to where you're arguing about 12 versus 13, and you do have automatic qualifiers from the conference champions, like, we don't have as much to vehemently argue about. Like the teams that have a legitimate shot to win the title and like are fairly deserving for the most part are going to get in. So it will not be as big of a deal. That's why we're advocating for this change. Right now we have the system that we have, and it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad, and it certainly favors the brands. It certainly favors typical conferences. So I'm not even going to read too much into that. I mean, is there hypocrisy in like all kind? Yes. I mean, every single week. But even a perfect committee would have some hypocrisy show up here, because you just can't stick to hard and true thought patterns and processes every single week and be perfectly consistent across the board. There's just too much going on for that to actually be legitimately possible. Alan, I see in the chat, John is a QT guy. Yes, I'm a big QT guy. No spicy chicken taquito today, but I've been getting a lot of Quick Trip drinks. Shout out to my friends at Quick Trip. # not a sponsor. Could be. Not a sponsor, though, right now. I also saw somebody, hey, Mac, how's the new job working out in KC? It's been really good so far. I'm 2 weeks in. I've enjoyed it quite a bit. Really nice people, really good company, and I think it's going to go pretty well. So I'm enjoying things. Life is still a little bit scattered and crazy, trying to get everything figured out with the new move and situated and settled. But it's been pretty good. It's been pretty good so far. So thank you for asking. Okay. Cincinnati, if we want to talk a little specific Cincinnati here, because I'm seeing some people, let me pick a question out here. I know that we had some Cincinnati talk earlier. Here's the deal with Cincinnati. I think that I see Kevin Scott Bailey, 1 Georgia, 2 Cincy. All right. I like that. Look, Cincinnati could not have had worse timing with this game against Tulsa. And I said before, I believe it was last week or 2 weeks ago on this channel, Tulsa's record does not look good, but they have played a ridiculous schedule. I mean, so they played Cincinnati, Ohio State, Oklahoma State for sure, all 3 of those teams. And there may even be more meat to that I'm missing. That's 3 teams in the top, 11, 12 of the college football playoff rankings initially. So that's grossly difficult for Tulsa to go play. So they're better than the record shows, but that's not a great team. And when Cincy, it's the double whammy of having College Game Day there this Saturday, and at the same time having it coming off of the initial rankings where there's a lot of complaining about where you're at, and Cincinnati fans, rightfully so, were fighting for the fact that they should be higher. They should be. They still should be after this week. and what happened against Tulsa. Again, let me remind you, Ohio State was in a position where Tulsa had the ball with a chance to tie the game in the fourth quarter at the horseshoe, at the shoe. That was a thing that happened this year, and we can't just write it off and say, well, that was way back when Ohio State wasn't as good. No, Ohio State's still farting around with bad teams. C7 lost Nebraska, who they barely escaped with a win against on Saturday. So that comes into play here, and remember that when you're evaluating the Cincinnati win. But admittedly, they did themselves no favors at all with the optics of that game coming with game day there and your chance to really make a statement. Game day goes to a game against Tulsa, which, no offense to the Golden Hurricane, but that's not like a super marquee matchup. That's not a top 10, top 25 matchup that game day would typically go to, right? They kind of went out of their way to give you some shine. And fair or not, you have to take advantage of those opportunities if you're Cincy, because you just frankly will not get that many opportunities to do something like that as an Alabama, whoever that you want to point out up near the top of the rankings would typically get. So you have to take advantage of that, and they didn't. And it also came at the time where everybody is fighting as hard as they can for your spot in the rankings. And then you go and have a game that, I don't know if laying an egg is totally fair, but it just was not a strong, dominant performance, which is what everybody obviously wants to see. I mean, again, I think this year is proving to us that nobody out there, no team other than Georgia, is capable of dominating and taking care of business on a weekly basis like they should be able to. There's nobody out there doing it. So I don't think Cincinnati should be penalized all that much for it, because we're seeing the same thing out of Alabama, Ohio State, and Oregon, and teams like that, and Oklahoma, like all these other teams that are around them in the top 10. We're seeing the same thing from those teams. So I don't think they should be penalized as much, but that also, it's making my job more difficult. I mean, I'll say that Cincinnati is certainly making my job more difficult every week that goes by where they're not producing any sort of style points here. Again, I don't think the difference should be as staggering as people view it between them and some of those other top teams, but you need to help me out. Help me help you, Cincinnati. Help me help you. Please do. And, I mean, it's not just just the optics at the end of that game were so bad. Like the Desmond Ridder fumble there at the end, what happened there? I mean, that is not typically something that like a great, well-coached team is going to do. And I think Desmond Ridder is fantastic. I'm not going to, crush him just go over the top with that. But it's just everything that happened there. Like you gave Tulsa multiple chances at the end of the game, even after it had already been close. There were not very good optics about any of that for Cincinnati. So it's going to be tough. It is going to be tough to continue to defend them as vehemently as I have. And all, I can change my mind. I will say that is giving me some pause toward, will Cincinnati be able to run the table? But it doesn't give me pause as to is Cincinnati deserving of a playoff spot? Yes, I still think they are deserving of a playoff spot because, again, we're talking body of work for the season, third best win in college football at Notre Dame, a team that, by the way, continues to win. On top of going and playing another Power 5 team in Indiana, beating them on the road, going back to last year, unbeaten, having Georgia beat until a very, very close loss in the end on the last second field goal. That stuff all matters and buoys their case to me here, because you have to allow them to do that if you're Cincinnati, if it's a group of 5 team. So I'm on board with Cincinnati being deserving. But that does not mean that I have a lot of confidence in them right now to finish this thing off and go unbeaten. They're going to have 2 games left coming up against Houston, right? Or potentially, SMU lost again, didn't they, on Saturday? So it's going to be Houston, right? You have 2 games coming up against Houston at the end of the year, and then in the conference championship game. I am becoming more doubtful that you're going to be able to hold up your end of the bargain and go through unbeaten. I think that's really where my mind has changed and where I'm different than a lot of people. Whereas a lot of people would be pounding the table they're not deserving of a spot in the playoff right now at this point. No, my thing is they are, but I am becoming less confident that they can finish the job and do their part to actually get through there to the point where they would earn that spot by going through undefeated. That is what I have a lot of worry about Cincinnati on that front. And that is the thing that'll really kill any of us that have stood up for Cincinnati throughout the year. Again, unfair as that standard may be, still would be a phenomenal season and a great coaching job by Fickle and all that, but they lose once and just an avalanche is going to come down on not just Cincinnati supporters, but any group of 5 team that wants to make noise in a non-expanded playoff or have any shot of getting in, it's going to just kill a lot of that the way that this is starting to go. So I am much more nervous about the possibility of that happening for Cincinnati. Now, ultimately, do I think their playoff chances are done because of that? I would actually have a fairly contrarian opinion on that and say that I don't think that Cincinnati's playoff chances were ultimately affected very much one way or the other by what happened on Saturday against Tulsa. Because if we're putting ourselves in the minds of the committee, I mean, the committee had all basically already said, yeah, there's nothing you can do. The committee had basically already said, there's nothing you can do short of there being a lot of chaos in front of you. And, maybe if we have to put you in because there's enough chaos and the right scenario comes up, all right, but that would be begrudgingly, and there's no clear path to it. There was not a clear path to it based on the first set of rankings. There's not a clear path to it now. I don't think the Tulsa game really changed that much one way or the other. And, we can say style points and all that. It certainly would not hurt. It would not hurt. I do think it would help a little bit. But is it going to make a monstrous difference? I don't know that there's much Cincinnati can do the rest of the way. Because, again, the double statement was laid out there. Cincy, you're number 6, and everybody else in your conference can't get ranked over freaking Minnesota, who now has lost to Bowling Green and Illinois in the same year. But we're going to have them. We're going to have more respect for them than your peers in your conference. So that was what was laid out and levied against Cincinnati. So, to kind of pay off the tease here and what a lot of people are going to be talking about, how does this affect their playoff chances? I don't think it affects it very much at all. Because unfortunately, I don't think the chances were very high based on what we saw out of the committee in week 1, which again brings me right back to of course we're going to be upset about that. And of course people will be upset about that and talk about that quite a bit because it put Cincinnati back behind in this position where they were just never going to be able to crawl out of. Boom to the Sooner. Appreciate another donation. If you want to be like Boom to the Sooner and donate here to the cause and make sure your question or comment gets up to the top and separates itself from the chat, just click the donate button, the $ below the say something box, the chat box there in the chat. Boom to the Sooner. If all of these teams took losses and Notre Dame and Cincy went out, would they dare put Notre Dame and Cincy in the playoff? Well, God, I have to really think closely about that scenario and how it is that plays out. Well, Notre Dame, in the right scenario, Notre Dame absolutely could still find their way in the playoff. I mean, that's another team we've seen get some benefit of the doubt before. I don't think quite to the level of Ohio State, Alabama, but they're still certainly a brand. They're certainly something that's going to sell. And ultimately what you have here is like a TV contract that you're worried about. Yeah, Notre Dame could definitely get in there. Cincy is the one where it's just they will invent any possible scenario to keep them out. Now, if Cincinnati and Notre Dame both went out and you have unbeaten Cincinnati with a win at Notre Dame and they're going to try and squeak Notre Dame in there, can you imagine the avalanche of criticism that would come if Cincinnati got left out and Notre Dame got in that scenario? So, to answer your question, if you're going to have one and the one be Notre Dame, which I think would almost be the better bet to have some shot to get in here, if you're going to have one, you'd have to have the other. Otherwise, it would just, that even I think takes it beyond just some of the bad logic that's been utilized by the committee here. That would be a pretty indefensible thing to have happen. So potentially, but I don't know. There's just so much that would have to happen. I don't know what the scenario is that would play out specifically there. Boom to the Sooner for that to actually happen. But I would love to see it if it meant that Cincinnati got into the playoff and that the committee was put in an awkward situation, because at this point, I'm just kind of here for that. Awkward situations. And let's go ahead and make sure that everybody is a little bit uncomfortable. Okay, where did we? I thought I got another comment in here from SEC country. Yeah, SEC football. As an A&M fan, I don't want an expanded playoffs. I would rather play Bama once a season instead of having to do it again in the playoffs. 4-team is the best chance to keep Bama, Clemson, and OSU out. Well, yeah, I don't know. A&M fan, I don't. If I'm an A&M fan long term, I think I would be more in favor of the expanded playoff because you're going to have a better chance of getting in that way than being the SEC champion every single year. I think you have to think bigger picture and longer term than that. Your best bet is going to be getting in as an at-large because you play in the SEC West, and that's just such a bear to get through to the title game, let alone win the SEC title. So I would certainly be much more cognizant of that and concerned with that if I were you as a Texas A&M fan. John, they would totally say that Notre Dame only lost the top 5 Cincinnati and leave out Cincinnati for only being Notre Dame. Well, Rob, I would not put something like that totally past the committee. I would think that that is a bridge too far, but I would not put that totally past Cincinnati. Let's talk Oklahoma State here, because the Cowboys have not received enough shine. This is a Big 12 centric channel, and we need to be giving them some shine here. And I see Alan brings them up. Alan says, I like Oklahoma State, but let's get real. Cowboys have beaten the Sooners 18 times in 117 years. What are the odds of them of beating them twice in 1 year? Astronomically low. Yeah, so the topic there being like, if Oklahoma State's going to make the playoff, it would obviously take 2 wins over Oklahoma, one in the Big 12 championship game, one at the end of the year. Yes, fair point. Mike Gundy has not been good against Oklahoma. Nobody throughout the course of time has been at Oklahoma State has been very good against Oklahoma, as you appropriately pointed out there. But we do need to talk about the possibility, because it's there, and a big part of this conversation has been Oklahoma playing all these close games against virtually everybody on the schedule, right? And that would leave open the possibility they could lose to Oklahoma State. And Oklahoma State has proven to be as rock solid as anybody in the conference so far this year. And if we're talking about like resumes in terms of wins, Oklahoma State has better wins probably than Oklahoma to this point in the season. So I think it's fair to at least bring them up. If we're going to have conversations about Team X controls its own destiny, or Team X at least could somewhat control its own destiny and be in that conversation, like the Michigan States of the world, Oklahoma State deserves to be there based on what their resume has been so far this year and the potential of what's left on their schedule. Because beating Oklahoma twice, disrespect or not for the Sooners right now, that would carry some level of weight for the committee to be able to do that twice. If you're Oklahoma State, and tack that on to everything else you've accomplished this year. The possibility is there. If there is some chaos in front, which this has been a year where it's been pretty chaotic, if there is some chaos in front and Oklahoma State does beat Oklahoma twice, they belong in that conversation. And the Cowboys deserve to be in the top 10, which we may well see this week. I don't put anything past the committee, but they're going to start creeping up there. And Bedlam is going to be a massive, massive game. And if Oklahoma goes into that certainly unbeaten and you knock off Oklahoma, well, now we're talking about a team that's right in the thick of things heading into that Big 12 championship game, what would be a rematch coming up the next week. So I think Oklahoma State is hurt by a couple of things here in terms of like the national conversation. I think that the fact that they're not like they don't play a sexy style of offense, which used to always be Oklahoma State. They were a sexy offense with Justin Blackmon and Brandon Whedon, Des Bryant, like all those kind of playmakers running around, Chuba Hubbard. It's not even that, like the big time ground game anymore. That's just not Oklahoma State. They've been winning with like rock solid defense, fairly erratic quarterback play, and Jalen Warren, who's a really good player, but not quite as flashy as like what Chuba Hubbard was, or James Washington, like some of these other guys that they've had on the offensive skill position side, Tylan Wallace. Not quite as sexy. They've just been like solid and slowly creeping their way up, and continue winning games and playing good football. And I watched a decent chunk of the West Virginia game. I mean, they look pretty darn good against West Virginia on Saturday. I would not put it past them. I certainly think they're capable of beating Oklahoma in Stillwater. History be damned. They are very capable of beating this year's Oklahoma team in Stillwater and what's going to be a juiced up crowd. First game between those two since Oklahoma decided to leave for the SEC. That will be an insane crowd, an insane environment at Boone Pickens Stadium. And I would not put it past them to win that game. And then if you win that, and we're talking about you've got a one-loss regular season going, and you pop into the Big 12 championship game all of a sudden, that's just a one-off neutral site. Like, why couldn't they go out and win that again? I understand the history, but this year. This is a different thing. I think they're more than capable of doing that. A tall task, yes, but they are capable. And so that means we need to bring them into the discussion here. And there just has frankly not been enough discussion about the Cowboys this year. They deserve a lot of credit. And I did not expect this year. I did not expect that out of them. Mike Gundy, I think, the program in Stillwater had seemingly become fairly stale, and he was kind of just 7 or 8 wins a year. They hadn't hit those high highs. They had a disappointing year with Rudolph and Washington when they both decided to come back. There had just been kind of some calluses building up seemingly with Oklahoma State, and excitement within the program and juice within the program. So to me, this has sort of come out of nowhere for Oklahoma State. especially with the way like Spencer Sanders started the year at quarterback, like just so inconsistent. There's been some fortune along the way. See the Boise State game and that fumble return that got whistled dead. But regardless, Oklahoma State deserves a ton of credit, and they're as capable as anyone in this league of beating Oklahoma twice to get themselves into prime, at least playoff consideration. They really are. Trevor, John, can we get a moment of silence? I don't know. Is that a moment of silence for the ACC's playoff chances? Is that just a moment of silence in the chat? Here, I can give you a moment of silence while I take a drink. Hopefully that sufficed. A little moment of silence for you. Robert, man, appreciate the donation, Robert. Much appreciated. Thank you for hanging out in the chat. Thank you for being here. Very generous donation. Robert says, keep speaking the truth, John. We need more of you. Grateful BYU fan. Thank you, Robert. Shout out to the Cougs. I'm assuming, I didn't even look, Robert. I assume BYU beat Idaho State by 50 or, 100 by a lot this weekend. And they'll continue creeping their way up inside the top 15 of the playoff rankings. So fair. And I appreciate the donation. I appreciate you hanging out here, and happy to see BYU doing what it is that they're doing now, not just this year, but last year, backing that up. I see Quana in there. Haha, OU needs a quality loss to Oklahoma State. They really do. Like, that seems to be the in vogue thing here. Quality loss. You need a quality loss. And this is what I mean by the logic of the committee will continue to bounce all over the place, and just they'll move the goalposts on whatever. But one of the more ridiculous things I heard was in defense of Minnesota. It was like, well, they're down to their third string running back and still doing this, and we're impressed by that. Okay, so what these teams need to do is have their third string running back be playing. They need to bench their first two or make sure that they have guys getting hurt. Like, what is that? What kind of logic is that? We can't be doing that. We can't be doing that. But I'll have, I'm sure, much more to say about the committee this week. Live show may well just start being on Tuesdays now instead of Wednesdays, because I like the fresh reaction to the rankings. So I would say plan on that tentatively for this week. I've still got about another 10 minutes or so here on this chat, so I'm not leaving you quite yet, but just to plan for the rest of the week. Keep that in mind. I do enjoy the idea of that. But we have to talk Texas. Samuel brings that up. Self brings that up. Self says Texas will never sniff being a relevant program ever again. And by the way, if you want to be like Boom to the Sooner, Robert, the guys that have been in the chat here donating, and really appreciate that. You can click the $sign below the chat box where it says donate. I saw Will, I saw you donated as well. Appreciate that. I will just caution everybody, if it's less than $5, it doesn't like tag it up at the top. So I probably should say that every time. If it's less than $5, it still does kind of blow by me in the chat sometimes, easy to miss. But Will said, why is Bama losing somehow better than Cincy winning? Yeah, I mean, look, now we're back to like parsing some of the details of this conversation. I would not say that it was a great loss for Alabama there. It is a loss, but Bama just gets the benefit of the doubt because of the recruiting rankings, the pedigree, everything. The Feinbaum example, 4 games where they just didn't want to show up. You'll get the benefit of the doubt. It's like, oh, you were just bored and didn't want to show up, as opposed to you're just not a very good team. Cincinnati gets hit with, you're just not a very good team, even though they continue to win these games. But Texas gets drilled by Iowa State 30-7. They give up 27 unanswered points. 4-game losing streak, which again, worse than anything Tom Herman ever did. It's the longest losing streak since 2010 for Texas. They spent $37 million this offseason to get this coaching staff. Again, let's let that sink in. Texas paid $37 million this offseason for a 4-game losing streak and a season in which they're going to have to fight like hell to make a bowl game in the final 3 games of the season. This is coming off of 3 straight top 10 recruiting classes that Sark inherited. This last one on the 24/7 composite was like 15, but that's one where Sark at least had a hand in it. So I went back to the previous 3 years. Tom Herman had recruiting classes that on the 24/7 composite were 3, 3, and 8. 3 straight top 10 recruiting classes. And that is why, to pay off another tease for you guys, the dumbest storyline of the Big 12 season is the one that was pushed by Texas media and Texas fans that it's a talent problem and that Tom Herman did not leave Steve Sarkisian with enough talent. And that's the issue here. Wait until he gets in and gets his talent up and going. Then we'll see what's what. Get out of here. Like, I didn't even, but before I even looked, I didn't even look when I first started seeing that at what the rankings were. I just assumed, like, well, look, to say that the talent or the talent is the issue at Texas is just asinine. Of course, it's not the talent, but I didn't even realize it was that good. I figured Tom Herman was putting together top 15 classes. I didn't realize they were top 10 classes. Like, there is a lot of talent in Austin. It's certainly enough that going bowling should not be an issue here. But instead, we sit here in Texas, 4-5. Their only Power 5 wins this year are against teams that fired their coaches in Texas Tech and TCU. That's it. That's it. Now, Texas has Kansas, which is kind of hilarious this week because, of all things, Kansas playing a close game with Texas, or even, gasp, beating Texas like they did not too long ago would just be perfect right now. It would be like chef's kiss, perfect right now based on the situation that Texas is in. But they should win that game. I saw Kansas up close and personal this weekend, and my God, are they just awful. But K-State then at West Virginia, left on the schedule after that for Texas. Those are going to be two tricky games for the Longhorns based on the way they're playing right now, and they'd have to win at least one of those to get to a bowl game. So it's going to be a fight for Sark, and it's not just what's what's happening on the field, but there's a circus off the field, quite literally. Like, monkeys are a part of the circus, right? I'm right about that, right? They have monkeys in the circus, so it's like quite literally a circus that's going on off the field for Texas at this point. But you throw on top of that Joshua Moore got into like an altercation this week with Sarkisian at practice. There's just nothing going very well or very smoothly. And I questioned the Sark hire at the time. I started to go back on it at the beginning of this year thinking, well, the offense does look better and more innovative, and they're actually giving the ball to Bijan, which Tom Herman wasn't doing enough of last year. And so I got kind of sucked into it and sucked into the bright lights and the shine that is there for Texas. But, what you find out is once you go in, it's this building with a beautiful facade, but there's nothing in there. There's no guts to it. There's nothing in there at all. And that's what Texas is. And that's what Texas has been for the last 15 years. It's just this is a more accentuated version of that, which is not what Texas expected to be getting with Steve Sarkisian. And so can we put to rest how ridiculous of a storyline it was that Texas, and I shouldn't say was, because I'm sure this is still many Texas media fans, et cetera, fanboys' opinions at this point, that it's a talent thing. Sark needs to get his guys. It's deeper than that, Texas. Like a 4-game losing streak and being 9 games into the season with only 2 Power 5 wins and both being against teams that have fired their coaches. That is a deeper problem, even if you want to tell me that talent really is the issue, which again is asinine because of 3 straight top 10 recruiting classes. But even if you wanted to tell me that was the issue, there's something deeper going on there when you're still losing 4 straight. You're blowing all these leads in the second half. Now, Iowa State, that was not so much of like a blown lead as it just was they were incompetent all the way around in the second half. But these like disturbing second half performances, there's something deeper going on there. And I think it may be that, hey, guess what? Steve Sarkisian's just an okay coach. Like, he was not a great coach. I think it's very debatable who the better coach, like who has the better coaching chops between Sark and Tom Herman. And Texas felt the need to pay $37 million to rush Sark in there just for the sake of it being someone different, and be careful what you wish for. And it just, again, you talk about chef's kiss, like all of this happening on the heels of Texas taking off for the SEC because they think they are too good for the Big 12 and they have to separate themselves from all of these loser programs. Well, they continue to just flounder here at 4-5 with a mess off the field, a mess on the field. It's just wonderful. And I very much am here to soak it all up and enjoy it while I can, because Texas, the biggest thing you are taking away from me and the rest of us by leaving for the SEC is not allowing us to enjoy this as up close and personal. It will not be as fun to watch Texas go 6-6 or 5-7 in the SEC as it was to watch them go 6-6 or 5-7 in the Big 12, which has happened fairly frequently here in the last 15 years. Texas robbing us of that is the biggest detractor to what it is that they're doing by going to the SEC. So I would tell everybody else here in this chat, those of you that really enjoy watching Texas suffer, you should probably continue to soak it all in right now, because we're not going to get many more opportunities to do this. We just are not going to get many more opportunities to do this. Will, appreciate the donation, Will. Texas is the KU of college football. They're a blue blood with a lot of history, but like KU b-ball, they don't actually have many titles, mostly hype. Yeah, I actually would say that that's insulting to the Kansas basketball program, because Kansas basketball wins the Big 12. I mean, basically every single year, right? There was the 15 in a row. I don't know. I got lost there in the shuffle. How many Big 12 titles Bill Self won in a row? But I mean, he absolutely just dominated the conference. I see the comparison there, and Kansas has had some embarrassing losses in the NCAA tournament, but I'll take shots at Kansas, but only where deserved, or maybe just a little beyond. But I'm not going to compare their basketball program to Texas football, because I think that is frankly insulting to Kansas basketball. Texas football has been much worse, much more disappointing, and frankly, a place with more resources. Like, Texas football has greater resources than Kansas basketball does, even relative to its peers. So it's been even more disappointing, even more embarrassing what Texas football has been than even if Kansas basketball were akin to Texas football. Resources-wise, Texas football still blows KU hoops out of the water. So much more embarrassing, but I appreciate the thought there for sure, Will. Cyclone Steve, they said Texas had 74 and 5-star recruits the last few years, and ISU had 4, but they had the same total record. That was a great graphic, Cyclone Steve. I saw that. The crew at Fox did a great job, or FS1, right? That game was on, but they had an awesome graphic. It did say that it was 4 and 5-star recruits. Texas was like 70. Iowa State was like 4. And then it showed their record over the last 4 or 5 years. And it was the same record. And it's exactly what it is, man. It's exactly what it is. And it kind of all comes back together with the beginning of this chat, when we had the SEC country in here saying, oh, but Florida and LSU are better. But they're not better than teams Oklahoma has been barely skirting by, just because they have all these stars next to their name. What you do on the field matters. Organization, coaching, all that stuff still matters. You can't just write it off and say, well, they're more talented, they're the better team. Texas is the perfect example of that. Donnie Hard, you said if OU beats Baylor, OU would have to win out. I don't know if you're talking to me or talking to somebody else in the chat there. I don't know. Maybe I'm catching up late to the chat. I don't. Obviously, Oklahoma would, at this point, have to win out to make the playoff, because the committee has set that precedent with where they rank them early on. So, yeah, I think that's. I'm losing some steam here. Let me check my outline, make sure I'm not missing anything else that's real pertinent and important that I wanted to get out here. I think that's pretty much it. I was going to add, and I don't mean to rub salt in the wound for Baylor fans. I just think the possibility is still there that Baylor is going to be like an 8-4 team, which is what I've said for a while now. I'm certainly not wishing ill will on Baylor, but it was not the most shocking thing in the world for me to see them go down to TCU. And shout out to Chandler Morris, shout out to Jerry Kill, everybody who got that ship in order. Shout out to Gary Patterson, who was helping them coach this week, even to get ready for the game, even though he's not actually the coach there anymore. But yeah, I think the problem for Baylor is when the game is in the hands of Gary Bohannon, I don't know that he's on that level to go win a game. And they're not head and shoulders above everybody else to be able to survive a clunker like that consistently throughout the Big 12 schedule. Dave Aranda to me is still the Big 12 coach of the year easily right now. So, and even if he finishes 8-4, he's still the Big 12 coach of the year to me. They're still a very good team. They may well whoop up on K-State in a couple of weeks, which I think is now looking like a much more intriguing game with K-State at 6-3. That's in a couple of weeks. I'm really looking forward to that game. But, having said all of that, kind of a comeback down to earth result for Baylor. Baylor's been a great story. I've enjoyed watching them play this year, but also it was fun to see TCU go out and ball and play the way they did for a program that's been going through a lot here lately. That's been a tough year for TCU for a number of different reasons, in addition to just the on-the-field results. But, okay, this chat's gone a little bit longer than I've been doing here recently. Thank you guys, everybody who hung out. Shout out to everybody who donated in addition to hanging out. Really, really appreciate that. You guys are great. I'll be back at it with some more content this week. Probably a live show on Tuesday or Wednesday, but I'm thinking Tuesday. The immediate reaction to the college football playoff rankings is probably the way to go right now. So take care, guys. Continue to support the channel. Follow me on Twitter at JL Kurtz. Continue to subscribe, share the videos, tell your friends. Best thing you can do for me right now, if you have friends that are Big 12 football fans, spread the word to them about the channel. Let's continue to grow this thing, and I will talk to you guys soon.